Okay, well, if we're ready to start, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this Q&A session, following our webinar that we did a couple of weeks ago on climate change, migration, and COVID-19. Before we begin, I just wanted to take this second to get some housekeeping out of the way and take this opportunity to introduce myself. I'm Victoria. I am the Digital Communications Coordinator here at Climate Outreach, and I will be facilitating today's session. We have had lots of questions submitted to us in advance via email, but please do feel free to use the chat function in the Zoom meeting. Alex is doing some clicking. Yeah, so please do feel free to use the chat function, either message me privately or drop your questions into the public facing space. If you would like to share or tweet anything from today, we kindly ask that you use the hashtag, which you can see in the top left corner, which is hashtag CliMigCovid. And I will drop that into the chat as well in just a second. That's here. The session is scheduled to run for just over an hour, but we have allowed for a little bit of extra time for run over. So it is my pleasure to introduce Alex Randall. As some of you know, Alex heads up our program here at Climate Outreach, which looks at the connections between climate change and migration. He also advises a number of key international agencies and governments on their responses to climate-linked migration and displacement. Alex has written extensively on climate change and migration for numerous media outlets and authored a number of book chapters focusing on connections between climate change and the rights of refugees and migrants. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Alex, who will do a quick recap on the webinar, Climate Change, Migration and COVID.
Okay, thanks everyone. Great to have you all with us. So what I'm going to do is spend about 20 minutes just providing an outline of how these three issues of climate change, the movement of people, and the pandemic that we're currently in relate to each other. And the aim is to provide a really quick overview of, as I see it, what the key connections are between these issues. And then, as Victoria has said, at the end, we'll open up for discussion, and the bulk of this session will be a chance for us to address the questions that you as the audience have got for me. So really what I'm going to do now is look really quickly at how these issues connect. And I'm going to do that basically first by looking at two key ways in which climate change and the movement of people are connected. And then how COVID-19, how the current pandemic provides an additional complicating factor to those existing patterns of climate-linked migration and displacement. So the first key way in which climate change drives new patterns of human movement is displacement by sudden climate-linked disasters. So these are things that are familiar to us from the news. You know, we've got hurricane strikes, typhoons, these kinds of disasters, which are weather-related incidents which happen very quickly and are very, very destructive. In general, what these kinds of events create in terms of the movement of people is short distance displacement, right? So people tend not to move further than they possibly have to. People are moving in order to secure their immediate safety and their immediate survival as a disaster like a hurricane strike or a typhoon or a flash flood strikes. In general, the vast majority of this kind of displacement is internal. So mostly people are not crossing international borders. They're fleeing within their own country. They're not moving from one country to another, let alone crossing continents. Of course, there are some exceptions to this. Occasionally people do cross international borders post-disaster. However, really the vast majority of this, the bulk of this kind of movement is internal. In addition, and this is something key which we will revisit, is many of the people who are displaced, many of the people who move post-disaster or just before the disaster in order to avoid it, are part of evacuations, of organized evacuations. So they are moved by their government, by the military, by an NGO perhaps, and assisted in fleeing the immediate area in some organized fashion. So that tends to be the type of human mobility that these sudden climate-driven disasters create. And as we see the average global temperatures warming, obviously what we see is the severity and regularity of these kinds of sudden disasters increasing. So in the future, what we can expect to see is more episodes of this kind of sudden disaster displacement taking place. The movement tends to be temporary, so people tend not to move permanently out of the disaster hit area. Very frequently, people are looking to return almost as soon as possible to be part of reconstruction and rebuilding, and obviously in order to try and return to their homes and their workplaces and rebuild their lives. So what we're not seeing is permanent movement always as a result of these kinds of disasters. People often move while the disaster is taking place and in the immediate aftermath, and then return fairly quickly afterwards. Approximately 20 or so million people are displaced in this way every year. So, I mean, it's quite a striking figure. It varies a bit every year. The figures for 2019 came out just a couple of weeks ago. And but most years what we see is about 20 million people being displaced in this fashion. So this has huge implications when we begin to think about how this relates to the pandemic, because what we're not talking about is a relatively small number of people who will find themselves being displaced by these disasters. Also during a pandemic, what we're talking about is tens of millions of people who will find themselves in this extraordinarily complex situation. So what I want to do now is examine some of the ways in which this pattern of climate-driven sudden disaster displacement relates to the current pandemic, to COVID-19. And I think one of the key things that we'll see is a tension between the need to flee, the need to get out the way of a disaster as quickly as possible, and the need to maintain various kinds of restrictions of movement, or lockdown as they're commonly referred to, in order to try and control the spread of coronavirus. So what you can see is these two things are very much at odds with each other. On the one hand, people will need to move, they will need to leave a city, leave a location in order to escape the impacts of a flood or a typhoon or a hurricane. But at the same time, their government may also be requiring them to stay put, to stay in their house, or not to leave their city, or to agree to various kinds of restrictions on their movement in order to try and control the spread of the virus. So when certain places are faced with these two simultaneous questions, these two simultaneous issues, on the one hand, sudden disaster, on the other hand, the pandemic and the need to control it by reducing the amount that people move, these two things suddenly come into tension with each other. And I think that has huge potential either to result in people being injured because they are not fleeing a disaster which they really should be fleeing, or potentially to increase the spread of coronavirus, because in the act of understandably fleeing the disaster, they are also moving and coming into contact with new people who may be carrying it. So I think there are other issues where this becomes difficult as well. If, as I said, many people who move in the context of these sudden disasters are part of organized evacuations. Now, what you can see there is an evacuation flight. This is actually a photo from the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines in 2013. And I think the need for evacuation raises huge questions about whether it is possible to even do evacuations while maintaining various kinds of physical distancing and social distancing that are needed to control the pandemic. So again, this raises really difficult questions for people who are in disaster management and in disaster relief about how they are going to cope with evacuations, how they're going to organize evacuations while also trying to maintain various kinds of physical distancing measures. Another, kind of really common pattern that happens in the aftermath of disasters is the use of temporary shelters and camps. Now, what you can see there is a photo of the Superdome in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and you had about between 15 and 20,000 people basically camped out in what was a sports venue. And that's very common post-disaster, that you have people sheltering in sports centers, school halls, other municipal buildings. And what we know from the last few months of the spread of coronavirus is that it is often those enclosed, cramped spaces that make the spread of the virus much more possible. So the point I'm making here is that all of the things that are necessary in order to survive with and cope these sudden episodes of climate-driven displacement are also things which are going to be extremely unhelpful when it comes to controlling the spread of coronavirus, and that this basically presents municipal authorities and governments with some very, very difficult dilemmas which they will have to grapple with as they try to deal with both of these things. The other key point is that we can't simply just, hope that there are no major episodes of disaster displacement in 2020. The figures are fairly consistent. We've seen 15 or 20 million people displaced in this context every year for the last decade or so. So we know that a huge amount of this kind of displacement is going to happen during 2020, and therefore is also going to happen against the wider context of the pandemic. I want to move on to the second pattern of mobility that we see resulting from climate change impacts, which is migration in order to secure livelihoods. And what we're really talking about here is a form of migration which is often much less sudden, and is where the climate change impact, for example, a drought, water stress, or desertification is having an influence on someone's livelihood, on their ability to earn money. And this is obviously very common in agricultural areas where people's livelihoods are highly dependent on farming. And when we have episodes of drought, very often the first thing that is the first way that drought is felt by the people who live there is that agricultural incomes decline. And when that happens, people very often look to using migration as a way of replacing that lost livelihood, replacing that lost income by moving and finding work somewhere else. Very often, this form of migration results in patterns of rural to urban migration. People leave the countryside, they leave agricultural jobs in the countryside, and they look for non-farm work in urban centers. So it's an additional force driving what is actually a global trend of urbanization. Again, this form of movement tends to be short distance. People in general do not cross international borders or move from one continent to another. Really what people are looking to do is move the shortest distance possible to find alternative work that can replace their lost income that has resulted from the drought affecting their ability to farm. In general, we don't see huge patterns of en masse migration. It tends to be one or two household members moving at a time, leaving other family members behind and moving just kind of one or two people from each household in order to try and balance out the farming income and income from other sources for that household. Again, the movement tends to be seasonal and temporary. People move when a drought is particularly severe and then return if the drought alleviates. And they basically use this pattern of migration. They use migration as a way of balancing the household income during periods of drought. So it achieves several really important things. The first one is it achieves some financial security for the migrants who move. So the individual people who move are are able to work, they find a different job, and that provides them with an income. It also does something else really important, which is very, very commonly migrants who are working in this way are sending money back to their families. This flow of money is called remittances. And that flow of money back to the household members that have stayed behind helps protect them against the lost livelihoods resulting from the drought as well. There's also some evidence that that flow of remittances, that flow of money from the migrant workers working in the cities can be invested in various forms of small-scale climate change adaptation. So it might be used to further bolster and protect the farm that they have left, for example, by investing in things like improved irrigation or crop switching, or investing in the farm in a way that makes it possible perhaps to continue farming even during the drought, or at least make the farm slightly more resilient to future droughts. So it does create this really important flow of money. It provides security for the individual migrants through the remittances. It provides some financial security for the family they've left behind, and potentially helps build the resilience of the farm that they've left. So this pattern of livelihood migration is really, really important. So what happens to this during a pandemic? Well, I think there are several key things which we need to think about, which are very worrying. The first one is that urban economies during the pandemic have started to go into various forms of lockdown. So what this means is, you know, when a city introduces various forms of social distancing and lockdown, workplaces are closed, people are told they're not allowed to go to work, or perhaps even whole industry sectors are told that they have to stop operating. And clearly for the migrants who are working in those cities and in those industries, straight away that has taken away the income that they moved in order to try and gain. There's also a global economic connection as well. So regardless of whether a city has decided to introduce a lockdown or social distancing or introduce various kinds of sector-wide closures, nonetheless, as for example, as high streets in developed countries go into lockdown and people aren't going shopping, the demand for consumer electronics, the demand for clothes suddenly reduces, suddenly stops altogether. And it is very often those industries in electronics and in garment manufacturing that many of those migrant workers in cities in the global south are working in. So potentially they're hit doubly there. The global economic slowdown plus the localized lockdowns that they may be experiencing mean that suddenly that income for those migrants has disappeared. So that starts to break down this really important flow of income that we talked about before. Firstly, the financial security of the individual migrant has been negated. You know, they no longer have a job. So similarly, the flow of remittances, the flow of money that they're sending back to the family that they've left behind, disappears. And further, of course, that means that the family no longer potentially has that money to invest in making the business, making the farm more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So it's potentially wiped out what had become a really important livelihood strategy there. It also raises the question of whether people will begin to return from cities back to highly climate vulnerable areas. So for example, what we know is that many migrants have left drought-stricken areas to find work in cities, but as lockdowns continue and as the global economy slows and people are laid off from those jobs in garment manufacture, for example, they may well wish to return to the families that they left in the first place. And what that means is that there will be a flow of people returning from cities where they'd been earning money back to areas which are highly impacted by drought or by other climate change impacts. So what I've done there is provide a kind of whistle-stop tour of how how these issues connect, how climate change is creating new patterns of migration and displacement, and then additionally how those patterns of migration and displacement that we see resulting from those climate impacts are then further complicated by the fact that we're currently living through a global pandemic. There is a version of this presentation which is a little longer and has a bit more detail and a couple of case studies in it, which you can watch the recording of if you want to afterwards, and we'll be sending around a link to this recording and the recording of the extended presentation. But I hope what I've done there is provide a bit of an overview, and I think if it's okay, Victoria, we'll move on to the Q&A part of the session now. So I'll just unshare my screen.
Yeah, absolutely. That was great. Thank you very much, Alex. So I just want to reiterate that you are very, very welcome to submit questions into the chat box, either privately or to the public facing chat space. What I have done with the questions that have been submitted in advance is kind of try to lay them out in some sort of thematic order. What I will also do is when you're answering this first question, Alex, I'll actually link your original webinar into the chat box too. But first, starting with the first question, this kind of follows your discussion on the first point, which was patterns of movement, and you've highlighted two very different patterns just now. But the question here is, how predictable are some of these patterns of movement, and are they in any way beneficial to the monitoring of climate-linked migration during COVID, or in fact, any other potential pandemic that we might see in the future?
Sure. No, that's a really good question, and I think both of these patterns of mobility, I would say we have an overview of them. But in terms of being able to predict them, I would say the study, the academic discipline of trying to make those predictions is very much in its infancy, and it isn't always possible to make very accurate predictions about what's going to happen in the future. So for example, we can provide a kind of sketch of how these things are related, right? We can say, well, we know that when a sudden disaster like a typhoon strikes, we know that people will flee. We understand that much. But it's very difficult to say exactly how many people will flee, where they will flee to, and when they might be able to return. And that's partly because the pattern of displacement depends on a huge number of other things. So for example, it will depend on how well prepared that area is to deal with a sudden disaster like that. In general, areas, cities, locations that have invested more in various kinds of disaster preparedness will see lower levels of displacement. They'll see fewer injuries, they'll see fewer deaths, they'll see people able to return sooner. And areas that don't have money, don't have the resources to invest in that kind of disaster preparedness will see higher levels of displacement, more kind of complex situations unfolding, more deaths, and like longer periods before people can return. So it isn't simply a case of being able to say we can predict exactly how many people will move, because there are so many sort of economic and human factors involved. It's not like a straightforward disaster equals X number of displacees, because, you know, like the wealth, the infrastructure, the levels of planning all play a huge role in how many people are displaced, and the circumstances that they find themselves in during that displacement. So in that sense, prediction is both very simple and really, really difficult. We know that people will be forced to move. We know that displacement will happen. We know that people will have to flee and leave their homes. But there are so many other factors involved that are sort of not natural in that sense, right? They're to do with how society is organized. They're to do with policy. They're to do with wealth. They're to do with infrastructure. That it becomes very hard to make a kind of overall prediction of those kind of numbers. thinking about the other pattern of movement, the one which is much more like livelihood migration, where people are finding that drought is eroding their ability to farm, it's eroding the income that they get from farming. Again, this is even harder to predict in some ways. Like, we know that people move as a result of drought. We know that when people do find that their livelihood has been eroded or their income has declined, very, very often they migrate in order to find alternative work. But being able to specifically connect a particular drought to a specific group of people moving from one place to another is really, really difficult. And there are a number of ways that we can begin to study that relationship. So we're not just completely speculating here. We do know that pattern of migration exists. We do know that people are using it. So, for example, if you interview urban migrants about the circumstances of their migration, you interview them about their reasons for moving. Very commonly, you will find stories within their experiences about the impact of drought or other environmental climate-related forces that have made their life difficult, have eroded their income and forced them to seek alternative work. But it becomes much harder to try and turn that into predictions, right? So it's more difficult to be able to say, well, if we have a drought here, we know we will have so many thousands or so many tens of thousands of people moving. Some attempts at making those kind of predictions have been made. So there are models, there are computer models that have been built to try and model how that kind of mobility will unfold. So, for example, there was a report released a couple of years ago called Groundswell, which did exactly that, and it looked at how to predict those patterns of mostly internal climate-driven migration. So, yes, some predictions are possible, but it depends on many, many other things and very, very kind of complex relationships that involve not just the climate, but also economies and levels of planning and government policy. So, yep, we know that people are going to move as a result of climate change impacts. We know that people are going to be displaced by sudden disasters. We know that people are going to migrate to try and protect their income, try and protect their livelihood. But it's very difficult for us to look into the future and see exactly what kind of patterns that is going to result in.
Great, thank you, Alex. Yeah, so moving on to the next question that I have down here. In your previous webinar, you discussed vulnerable communities and safety, and just probably a slightly quicker answer maybe, as it just kind of touches on safety, about what you meant by safety and how you measure safety.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've used it there as a slightly catch-all phrase, but what I'm getting at is, firstly, the ability for people to protect what we might broadly call their health and their welfare. So their ability to, in the context of sudden disaster, to avoid injury, right? You're safe if you're out of immediate physical danger. In the context of the kind of livelihood migration, livelihood strategy, what we're really talking about there is safety, meaning their ability they're protecting their income such that they can continue to provide for the basic needs of themselves and the people who are dependent on them. So there's a kind of really basic level of safety that I'm getting at there. I think there's also a kind of rights-based way of looking at this question of safety that I use quite a lot, which is essentially safety from various kinds of rights violations. So you can look at it in terms of whether someone is free from exploitation, whether they have access to water. So you can look at these various things that form what are kind of universally regarded or very widely regarded as basic human rights. And I tend to use safety as a bit of a catch-all phrase, meaning that in general, people are in a situation in which those rights are not threatened. So what we can see when someone is fleeing a sudden disaster is they're increasing their safety in terms of just like their physical well-being, but they may also be moving somewhere where they are more likely to have access to fresh water, more likely to have access to shelter. And in the context of livelihood migration, we can see people moving in order to protect themselves in very similar ways. But we also know that many migrants who migrate seeking safety from one thing find themselves in situations where they are exposed to a new set of dangers. And we see that especially when you have young people migrating to cities in order to find work. Very often they are forced to live in what is usually that city's worst housing. They maybe don't have any access to healthcare. They are potentially highly vulnerable to exploitation by employers. It may be that they're working in part of the informal economy where it's very difficult for them to protect their own rights because they're working in some semi-legal situation where they won't want to report an employer for various kinds of misconduct or safety breaches or anything like that. So there's these questions of safety are really, really complicated, and I think it's a useful way of looking at it though, because people move in order to try and make themselves safer or to protect the safety of their family, but inevitably that involves trade-offs. They're moving from one kind of risk potentially to another kind of risk.
That's great. Thank you very much, Alex. I'm just going to kind of ask these questions that are coming through from the chat. So
yeah.
We've had a question or more a posing of curiosity to hear your thoughts on how countries closing their borders due to COVID, like the US on its southern borders, will impact climate displacement and migration, especially as the hurricane season begins. And following that, there's a question on, do models on cross-border climate-related migration exist, similar to groundswell for internal migration?
Yeah. Okay, so I think, this question of border closures as a result of the pandemic is really, really key. So I think, although it's true that a lot of the climate-driven mobility is internal, that's what the evidence points to. It is also true that if you look at cross-border movement, you do find many, many migrants, especially from Central America, who have crossed the border into the US, who do have a climate change dimension to their migration. I'm not saying they're climate migrants or climate refugees. I'm not saying climate change is the only reason that they made that journey. What I'm saying is for many of those people, drought was part of what eroded their livelihood and made their life difficult enough that they wanted to try and move. Now, with the increased levels of border control there, potentially what we're seeing is many, many people who really needed to migrate, they needed to move, they needed to cross from one country into another in order to achieve some level of safety or some level of security, are having that route taken away from them. Now, I think it's a very complicated situation, because if you look at the situation on the US-Mexico border, it was already a very, very brutal border regime. Huge amounts was already being invested in preventing people from crossing that border, and huge amounts of border infrastructure were being put in place to try and stop people moving. Various policies which were designed to act as a deterrent, like child separation, and the camps that people were being put in were designed to try and prevent people from making that journey. So I think potentially, the US had already made that journey very, very difficult and very, very dangerous. I think the complicating factor of coronavirus is twofold. Firstly, it's that people will be less likely to start making that journey at all in the first place, right? So it may be that people aren't even leaving their town or village of origin to attempt that journey because they think that they're likely to be stopped, you know, before they get very far because of the various lockdowns that their country of origin may be in. But I think the second thing, and this is the kind of much more worrying element of it, is the potential for the border regime that has been established by the US to accelerate the spread of coronavirus, right? They're keeping people in very, very confined conditions, in situations where it's really impossible to maintain any kind of physical distancing or social distancing. So I think, you know, those detention centers, those detention camps that were established to try and, you know, to try and prevent people making that journey are actually you know, potentially a source of, you know, accelerating the spread of coronavirus, which I think is very worrying.
Great, thank you very much, Alex. Just kind of sticking with this theme of governments and decision making.
Yeah.
We had a question submitted via email, which was, should we set up more task forces to prepare? And also, what happens when these existing groups run out of resources or money or, yeah.
Sure. So I think, you know, there's a huge question about countries' different abilities, and different levels of resources that they have for dealing, firstly, with various forms of climate-linked mobility, and then secondly, with coronavirus. So what we see across the world already is that countries that are wealthier and have been wealthy for a long time have invested in very resilient infrastructure, and they have resources to put into planning for various kinds of weather-related disasters, floods, hurricane strikes. That doesn't mean that within a rich country, that those resources are spent sensibly or equitably. But nonetheless, the vast majority of the climate and weather-driven displacement that we see every year happens in the global south. And that is simply because those countries do not have the cash to invest in resilience, in resilient infrastructure, and in planning for those kinds of disasters. That's not to say that they don't invest what they can. In fact, you know, some of the very best, some of the most advanced systems of disaster preparedness exist in countries in the global south. But at the end of the day, the more money you have to invest in it, the safer you can make your citizens. So what we see straight away is more displacement in poorer nations. And the pattern that we're seeing with coronavirus is also very likely that it is going to be those same countries which eventually are suffering more of the brunt of the pandemic. Because those are countries which also have less resources, less money to invest in healthcare, in public health, and in the various things that are going to prevent the spread of coronavirus. So I think what we can see is existing patterns of vulnerability created by poverty, meaning that some places have much higher levels of displacement, and that will be the same places that are impacted worse by coronavirus as well, because they are the same places that don't have the resources to invest in public health and healthcare system. So I think, yeah, that raises, there isn't a kind of bright side to that. My view is that even during a pandemic, even while wealthy countries are spending huge amounts of money in their own countries, they must continue with various kinds of aid and development and debt cancellation that they have been, and those will have to accelerate as well. I don't think there's a way around that. I think that, unpopular as those decisions may be, I think that wealthy countries like the UK, like various European countries, will simultaneously have to invest money in their own public health systems, and they will have to continue financing through aid and development and debt cancellation, public healthcare, and various kinds of climate resilience and adaptation in the global south as well. There isn't another way around it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. Another question that was submitted kind of within this theme is a twofold question on donors. So the first part of the question is, what is the opportunity for donors to support COVID measures on displaced populations?
Right.
How has this been received by host countries? And then the second part to the question is, what are the different narratives donors are using to describe the displacement of populations due to climate disasters and events like COVID? And how is this being received on a local level?
Right, yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think we know some of the answer to that question already, and there are other answers, part answers to that question which will emerge over the next few months. So I think, when we talk about the opportunities for donors to support, like measures to prevent the spread of COVID amongst displaced populations, well, like obviously there are opportunities for them to do it because there were like millions and millions of displaced people, so there's like no shortage of places that and populations that need that support. I think what we're seeing already is, various attempts to try and introduce forms of physical distancing in displacement camps and in refugee camps. So this applies quite generically across all displaced populations, like not just people who are displaced by climate change hazards, but people who've been displaced by conflict as well. And obviously we're seeing camp management, gearing up to deal with the spread of coronavirus and gearing up to try and prevent it spreading throughout those camps, through trying to bring in the measures which we know are effective already, hand washing, physical distancing, trying to kind of prevent people moving around as much as possible. But obviously that's far more difficult in a situation where you've got people living in a refugee camp. So I think that that's happening. You see the aid agencies, you see camp management beginning to do that already. You also, which I think has been positive as well, is we're seeing, especially in Greece, we're seeing kind of a simultaneous kind of attempts to try and get people who have family that they can go and stay with, to be allowed to leave those camps and go and stay with family that they already have living in Europe in proper accommodation in which it's possible for them to self-isolate or not be living in a camp, basically. So we recently saw a relatively small number of people from refugees who are currently in refugee camps in Greece being allowed to join family members that they have living in the UK. Right now, that's clearly a sensible public health measure. You can get people out of a camp where controlling the spread of the virus is very difficult, and you can get them into proper accommodation with family members where they can, where they can potentially, be one less person who's potentially a kind of vector in that camp. Now, I think again that's sort of controversial political decisions, because the UK has constantly been resisting family reunion for refugees and migrants. So I think in some senses, those decisions are going to have to be taken. It's going to firstly be about investment and investing money in making the displacement camps and the refugee camps that exist as resilient to coronavirus as possible. But ultimately, the real work is going to be in finding a more sustainable answer to the accommodation of those people, and family reunification is one of those answers. So I think that's that's the route that this has to take, certainly in Europe at any rate.
Yeah, Thank you. A really interesting question just popped up, which is quite a nice segue, actually. So thank you for the presentation. So it says that we're focusing mainly on migrants not in the UK, and yet there's a serious problem with respect to migrant workers here. Migrants here are on limited durations, cannot accept public funds, under no recourse to public funds. So are you studying the impacts of our policies on migrant workers here? And if so, have you found anything to be out of date?
Right. So the short answer to that is specifically we're not looking at those impacts, but I know that other people are. And I think there are, there were a number of ways in which the the ways that migrants and refugees in the UK are treated has played a kind of very problematic role in in dealing with this in a looking at it through a public health lens. So for example, if a migrant or refugee has no recourse to public funds, or they are an irregular migrant, they probably won't try to access healthcare services. They probably won't try to get tested. They probably, won't present with symptoms. And that means that then, by forcing people, by denying people access to healthcare, you essentially create a much more difficult public health problem, because you have people who aren't able to seek the healthcare that they need. So, like I said, that isn't an area that we've specifically been looking at, but yeah, it is certainly a major issue. The denial of healthcare services to migrants and refugees is obviously, obviously it's not something that should happen ethically or morally when we think about the rights and the welfare of those refugees. But additionally, as a public health question, the idea that you have part of your population who are not allowed to access healthcare during a pandemic is clearly a wider public health problem as well. But yeah, our focus mainly has been in trying to understand how these three issues of climate, migration, and the pandemic relate in countries in the global south. But I do know that there are people who are working on how migrants and refugees in the UK have been affected by coronavirus, and I can share some links to that work and that research, and we can maybe include those in the mailing that comes out afterwards.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you, Alex. I'm just going to jump to another submitted question that came through on the email, which is, are there any opportunities to translate lessons learned from COVID into policy changes that provide more opportunities for regular migration in general, and specifically for people who are particularly vulnerable to climate impacts?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I think, yeah, it's a really good question, and I think there was a lot of talk at the moment about what the parallels are between the coronavirus response and the response to climate change, and parallels between how, whether coronavirus and the pandemic teaches us things about other global issues that we're facing. And I think there are some interesting parallels and some interesting questions. I think Victoria, could you just kind of like recap the question quickly? I feel like there was something quite specific in it that I don't want to kind of brush past.
Yeah, for sure.
Hit me with the question again.
Yeah, for sure. It is, are there any opportunities to translate lessons learned from COVID into policy changes that provide for more opportunities for migration in general, and specifically for people who are particularly vulnerable to climate impacts?
Yeah, okay. So I think, yeah, I would say my take on the policy measures that are needed in order to deal with climate-linked migration and displacement in general, as a kind of guiding principle, it is usually better if you allow people to move. right? It is better if migration is easier. It's better if it's safer. So policies that encourage mobility or make mobility safer or create opportunities for people to migrate if they want to. Policies that allow people to stay. Anything that reduces the difficulty of moving from one place to another, anything that makes crossing a border safer, in general, I think is a sensible response to the way that climate change may alter patterns of migration. Now, so I would say, what can we learn from the response to coronavirus that we can apply to that? And I think the response to coronavirus has been very different. And it has mainly been about closing borders. It's been about stopping people from moving. It's been about restricting mobility in one way or another. You know, right down to the kind of household level. You know, like in the UK, we're encouraged not to leave our houses unless it's absolutely possible, you know, absolutely necessary. So in a way, the coronavirus response has been has necessitated a huge reduction in mobility. The whole idea is that we all move around less, and that tries to contain the virus. Whereas I would say that a necessary part of our response to climate-driven migration and displacement is that we have to make mobility easier and safer. So in terms of lessons from the coronavirus response that we can translate across into responding to climate-linked migration, in terms of the actual policies, I would say probably not. However, I think there is something interesting that we will hopefully see in the response to coronavirus, which is that I mean, so far I would say we haven't, but in the future, hopefully we will begin to have a more multilateral response to coronavirus. You know, we've seen the WHO being eroded by the US government and kind of knocked by Trump, and kind of its role diminished. But clearly the WHO has played a vital role in steering the global response to the pandemic. And I think that's been really key. And what we can learn from that is that actually many of the international institutions that we do have a really, really important role to play, especially, and this sort of sounds obvious, especially when we're dealing with a global crisis or global situation of some sort. Now, hopefully what we can take from the current pandemic is to realize that those international institutions, like various parts of the United Nations, like the WHO, are really, really key, especially when we've got something which isn't just contained in one country, when it isn't just like something that affects one nation at a time. And climate-linked migration obviously is one of those things, right? Because yes, it's true that a huge amount of the mobility will be internal, but that's the mobility that we're seeing right now. We don't exactly know what's going to happen under scenarios where the planet warms more extremely. There could be more cross-border movement. Similarly, there's a relationship between countries when we think about climate-linked migration, which is that the countries which are experiencing that migration and that displacement, even if it is internal, are in general the ones that are least responsible for the warming of the planet in the first place. So that necessitates some kind of relationship between the countries that historically have been high emitting countries and the countries which are experiencing the increased patterns of migration and displacement, and it requires them to negotiate about how how those climate change impacts will be compensated, how the additional costs which result from dealing with those levels of displacement are compensated by the countries that, after all, have benefited economically from being long-standing high emitters. And that requires international dialogue of some sort, and that has to be mediated through some kind of global institution, like the United Nations. So hopefully what we'll see is that states stop knocking multilateralism, that they stop running down the UN, that they stop defunding the World Health Organization. Because ultimately, I think, yeah, of course, these global institutions, some of them have problems, but ultimately, they are going to be needed, firstly, to deal with coronavirus pandemic, and secondly, to deal with climate-linked migration and displacement.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Alex. I'd like to kind of take a little switch to a different topic of question and come back to a question that was submitted fairly early on in the chat box. It actually links to a question that I have about the previous webinar where you used Bangladesh as a case study in the garment industry. So my question is, what do you think the global ramifications will be from these urban economies slowing down? And Peter actually asks, how will the relationship between climate and migration be affected as countries begin to lift restrictions and start to restart economies in the context of a post-lockdown world?
Yeah. Right. So in the longer version of the presentation, so for the people who joined the previous webinar, one of the case studies that we looked at was Bangladesh, and the reason that we looked at that case study was because what you see in Bangladesh is a very distinct pattern of climate-related migration. And a lot of that involves people leaving the delta region of Bangladesh, where the Ganges and the Brahmaputra rivers flow into the Indian Ocean. It created a kind of complex pattern of islands and rivers which are very low-lying. They're very vulnerable to storm surges. They're very vulnerable to cyclone strikes and river flash flooding of the river system. And the consequence of that is very often that you get salination of farming land. So as salt water is kind of washed up the rivers and out of the sea and onto the land, the farmland basically becomes inundated with salty water. And as that happens, it becomes progressively harder and harder to farm on it. So you have sudden disasters, which people flee, and then you have progressive erosion of farming livelihoods. So you've got kind of multiple environmental and climate-related drivers that create the need for people to leave that area. And very often, they move to Dhaka, the capital city, which has also become a central hub of garment manufacturing as well, mainly making clothes for export to wealthier countries. And the reason that I kind of picked that out as a case study is because firstly, you've clearly got this climate change dimension to the migration of many people who are working in the garment industry in Dhaka. I'm not saying everyone. I'm not saying everyone working in garment manufacturing in Dhaka is a climate refugee. I'm saying that many of them will have a climate change will have a climate change impact as part of their migratory story, and we've seen that come out in interviews with those people. So I think this raises a huge question for what happens to those garment workers over the coming months, because I think we're likely to see, firstly, various forms of lockdown brought in, if not already, in Dhaka, and that may or will restrict the ability of people to go to work in those garment factories. We may see those factories close completely, or we may see people quite rightly, unwilling to work in them if social distancing, physical distancing measures are impossible in those factories. But one way or another, by and large, I imagine the people working there will suddenly lose their income. Now, the other thing that's very likely to happen is in the world's wealthier countries, which are largely buying the clothes that are made in the garment factories of Dhaka, that pattern of consumption is drying up. It's changing at any rate. The high street shops in many cities in wealthy countries are all closed, right? And that was where a huge number of those garments were sold. So there's very likely going to be a huge drop in orders being placed for the manufacture of those clothes. And what that means is for people who are recent migrants who've moved from the Delta area into Dhaka and have those jobs in garment manufacture, they'll be faced with the question, do they stay in Dhaka and try to survive in Dhaka without a job, or try and find alternative work, or do they return to the Delta and potentially go back and live with their family? And either of those choices are very difficult, because on the one hand, staying in Dhaka potentially means staying in an urban center where and having no money, or trying to find a different job, whereas returning potentially means returning to a location where there maybe isn't enough agricultural work to support the entire family, or potentially even returning to a location which is highly exposed to flash flooding, to cyclone strikes, and to other kinds of climate-driven impact. So I use Dhaka as an example, Dhaka and the Delta region of Bangladesh as an example, because I think what you can see there is all these different elements of the pandemic, climate change, and migration colliding, right? The Delta region is highly vulnerable to climate change impacts. People are leaving the Delta to find work in other places, especially Dhaka. That then is kind of connected to the rest of the global economy very tangibly through the garment industry. So what we can see is that as a kind of center of where these three issues, climate change, migration, and the coronavirus, all kind of collide in one very obvious place. There's a bit more to that case study as well. So we'll send a link round to the previous presentation, which is on YouTube, so you can watch that and hear a bit more about that case study as well.
Great, and I have actually linked to the video of the webinar in the chat box here. So yeah, but we will definitely send that out. Just before we move on to our final few questions, I just wanted to kind of tail on to the end of that with one of the questions that was sent via email, which is, and you've definitely touched upon this in that answer, so I guess this is quite a quick one. So seeing as migration is an important climate adaptation strategy, how will the loss of remittances from migrants, which help families cope back home with climate disasters, impact their ability to do so this year specifically?
Right. Yeah, so this is really key. So what we know, just to give a kind of really kind of quick recap, we know that many migrants send money back to their families at home. We know that when there is a climate change impact, like drought or anything really, that those remittances act as a really important part of that family's income. And we also know that some of that remittance money may well be invested in various ways of coping with climate change. So that could be something quite obvious, right? It could be that a household that owns a small farm literally invests the remittance money in something that makes farming during a drought easier. Like they might invest that remittance money in improving irrigation on the farm, and perhaps they wouldn't have been able to do that were it not for one member of their family migrating, sending money back, right? But it also provides security against climate change impacts in slightly more subtle ways too. So, for example, it may well be that that money is invested in ways of diversifying out of agriculture altogether for that family. So it could be that they invest remittance money in setting up a business doing something outside of agriculture, which is therefore less impacted by drought, for example. Could also be that they invest some of that remittance money in helping additional members of that family migrate, right? So migration always comes with costs. It always costs something to move. And it may well be that a family can say, well, this additional flow of money has meant that we have managed to save some of it, and we can now use some of that money to help a further household member migrate, find work somewhere else, and so the cycle continues. So in the face of climate change, that flow of remittances becomes really, really key as a way of adapting to climate change, or a way of just surviving climate change, or a way of getting out of harm's way of climate change impacts. So my prediction is that without that flow of remittance money, we're going to see an increase in vulnerability to climate change impacts. Like I can't see that there's another way around that. Of course, as you make people poorer, they become more vulnerable to climate change. And when we have families who a large part or a significant part of their household income is from remittances, when you take that away, that family will be more vulnerable to climate change impacts. There's no two ways about that. So that raises a huge question of how can that money be replaced, or what can be done in order to try and replace some of that lost income, or how can those families be provided with something which gives them some security against climate change impacts, which had been provided by the remittances before. But yeah, there isn't a kind of bright side to that either, I'm afraid. Like, you make people poorer, they are more vulnerable to climate change. If a large part of their household income was from remittances, and that's disappeared, then definitely there's an increase in vulnerability there.
Yeah, I think that really nicely kind of links onto another question that was sent in, which is what's the best way to deal with and to address those challenges for distressed populations in a politically sensitive and a savvy way. So I guess that's about communication and about policy making, I guess, at a governmental level. That was how the question was posed.
Yeah, sorry, could you repeat that really quickly?
Yeah.
Your audio was a bit breaking up a little bit. No, it's fine.
Sorry. What is the best way to address the host of challenges for distressed populations in a politically sensitive and a savvy way?
Yeah, okay. So I mean, this is a huge question, right? How do you explain these issues in a way that's compelling? And I think, you know, the big question here is compelling to who? Because, as you know, part of our wider work at Climate Outreach is thinking about how you explain these issues, how you take these incredibly complex issues and you make them compelling, you make them interesting. How do you frame them in a way that pulls people into the discussion, whether that's the public or policymakers or whoever? And I think, you know, the question of climate-linked migration comes with an additional complication, because you're taking two really controversial topics straight away. You're not just saying, okay, how do we deal with one controversial issue, climate change? You're saying, how do we deal with two really controversial issues like climate change and migration, and trying to trying to explain that incredibly complicated connection, and then also trying to make sure that people are interested in it and that government policymakers are prepared to act on it. So there is a huge kind of communication question there. I would say, though, that there are some, you know, there are some things that we can do which I feel like are, you know, risk-free, sensible decisions if you're thinking about how you explain these issues. And I would say the first one is, as far as possible, always keep going back to human stories and the testimonies of migrants and their experiences, because you can get absolutely lost in, you know, like all of the evidence, which is really, really important. We need that in order to understand like what's going on. But we also, for the people who aren't going to read every single research paper and understand the computer models of it all, like we need to understand what this means for people. And the best way to do that is to ask people, right? And then to give them a platform in which they can explain what has happened to them and explain their concerns and explain the situation that they're in. And this is, most importantly, explain the kinds of things that are going to help and the kinds of things that are not, because that really ultimately is what has to be guiding any policy that we bring in. It has to be based around not what the guesswork we think might help, but actually on what people are saying is going to be useful. So it's those experiences that should be steering policy, of course. But I think it's also those testimonies and those experiences which will make this issue compelling and make people pay attention to this issue. So in general, I would say in every decision that you make about how you frame this, how you communicate this, you're constantly going back to the authentic experience of people who have who are in those situations.
Great answer. Really, really great answer. So my final question to you, Robin, I see that you've added another question in just here, and I think that I have an answer for you in my wrap up. So my last question to Alex is, what are the lessons or reflections on migration that COVID-19 has shed light on?
Sorry, your audio has just gone a little bit. Could you just say it again?
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's fine.
What are the lessons or reflections on migration that COVID-19 has shed light on?
Yeah, okay. So I think the key thing that I would take away from this is COVID has necessitated a huge amount of not moving around, right? Locally, it's meant that we've all got to stop moving around. Globally, it's meant that we've all got to stop going from one place to another. And what this really shows us is that actually mobility was really, really important. Like the ability to migrate, the ability to move was really, really important. Now, I don't just mean for the global economy. I don't mean just that we were, lots of people were kind of flying all over the place for business trips or work or whatever. Like, I'm not getting at that. What I mean is that for millions and millions of people, moving from one country to another was a way of surviving, right? It was a way of protecting themselves. It was a way of protecting their livelihood. It was a way of escaping difficult situations. And I think the sudden kind of cutting off of those patterns of migration, the sudden end to the ability to go from one place to another, has really shown us how key those patterns of migration were to people's survival. And I think obviously the people who had been engaging in those patterns of migration had known that for a long time. But for everyone who hadn't, I think, it shows us that migration has become not only a part of our lives that is enriching and important, but more than that, a really key way of people surviving. And I think when you suddenly take that away, which is what has happened during the pandemic, it really makes it clear how important it is.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. Yeah, that was really well put. Thank you so much. Please let me know if my audio cuts out, but I think that brings us to about time to wrap up. So I just kind of want to say thank you, Alex. Thank you for all of that information. It was so great, really well put. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for joining us. If you want to hear more about Climate Outreach's work on how to communicate effectively about climate change during the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, our colleague Robin Webster will be hosting a webinar next week on Thursday, that's the 21st of May. That will be held at 2 times, at 7 a.m. British Summer Time and 4 p.m. British Summer Time. And that will accompany the release of a guide on this topic. So Robin, in answer to your question about the arts, I think that will definitely be a question to pose there. I'm going to just send a link to some more information about that follow-up in the chat. If you just give me a second. Here. And then as Alex and I have both said, we'll be sending a follow-up email with the recording of this webinar and the previous one for those who weren't able to join live, or if you'd like to share it among your colleagues. So I guess that's closed. So thank you again, everyone, and please stay safe. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.